and plunged into his heart, leaving him lying there. And then there was the whole issue of how can this happen? Anyway, it's 10 o'clock. We should probably.
I was gonna say on that note, we just went live to YouTube, so they just heard that last bit, and I think that's a perfect segue to start. I do ask that everybody who does not have a speaking portion do mute your microphone. But without further ado, Susan, Jeremy,
I'll start with the pre-intro. Good morning. I'm Jeremy Garver, chair of the Lifelong Learning Committee of Ohev Shalom Congregation in South Orange, New Jersey, bringing you the best in Jewish adult education since 1860. In addition to the two distinguished and exciting professors on our program this morning, Professors McGinty and Nahme, we have a whole lineup of academics leading our programs for the next 2 months. On Wednesday nights at 8 p.m. on Zoom, the dynamic rabbi and JTS professor Marcus Mordechai Schwartz leads our Talmud study series, Between the Eternal and the Human, when human dignity and ritual practice are in conflict. On Sunday, November 8th at 10 a.m., the Rabbi Shapiro commemoration will feature the innovative Rabbi Eli Confer of Machon Hadar, speaking on How Can I Pray What I Don't Believe? On Sunday, December 13th at 10 a.m., Professor Glenn Inner of Sarah Lawrence College will speak on Jews and Booze, the little known but fascinating history of Jewish tavern keepers in Tsarist Russia. Finally, beginning Wednesday night on Zoom, November 18th at 7:30 p.m. and continuing for 5 weeks, Rabbi Cooper will lead us in Beyond Dispute, Debates that Shape Jewish Life, each introduced by a 10-minute video from a JTS scholar, Rabbi Jan Urbach, Rabbi Eliezer Diamond, Professor Marjorie Lehman, Dr. Alan Middleman, and Dr. Michal Raucher. And now, Susan Pascal Blackburn, who is the initiator and driving force behind this morning's program, and without whom it would never have come to fruition, and who is herself a formidable font of knowledge of Jewish history and culture, will introduce the speakers. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you, Jeremy. Hello and welcome to everybody. And I'd like to just thank Jeremy and Justin Geringer, who's taking care of our video today and helping us with all the technology, and he's just been amazing. And I'm part of the Lifelong Learning Committee, and I just want everyone to know that this program came about at a meeting of the committee 2 years ago. And I believe it was Mark Gordon who held up a copy of the Jewish Week or the Jewish News, I don't know which one it was, with pictures of all the Jewish men who were implicated in sexual harassment and sexual predation. We all learned the heartbreaking stories of the women's careers who were stymied and the personal consequences that ensued. Organizations and people did not take responsibility for the damage caused by sexual crimes. And I and our committee wanted to find out more and get some guidance and knowledge of what we can do about it and why is it happening. The subject has been timely ever since, unfortunately, but we're proud to have an esteemed panel to present and discuss the topics. Keren McGinty is a Forward 2018 Forward 50 honoree for her clarion call for a Jewish response to the hashtag #MeToo movement. She is named on Lilith Magazine's 7 Jewish Feminist Highlights of 2018 and was a Jewish Boston top pick. Her pioneering books, Still Jewish, A History of Women and Intermarriage in America, and Marrying Out, Jewish Men. I knew my cousin was going to call. Sorry.
Hey, baby.
Jewish Men
How are you?
Intermarriage and Fatherhood, sorry about that, providing groundbreaking analysis about Jewish continuity by focusing on gender and change over time. Dr. McGinty's advice and opinions have appeared in the Forward, Lilith, and Moment magazines, the New York Jewish Week, Ritual Well, Shema, and E-Jewish Philanthropy. She is a research associate at the Hadassah Brandeis Institute at Brandeis University. As of November 1st, Dr. McGinty will join the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism as the Interfaith Specialist. She was also the inaugural director of Interfaith Family Jewish Engagement graduate program at Hebrew College. She earned her PhD from Brown University and was the Mandel L. Berman Postdoctoral Fellow in Contemporary American Jewish Life at the University of Michigan's Frankel Center for Jewish Studies. Dr. McGinty currently serves on the Sexual Misconduct Committee of the Association for Jewish Studies and on the board of the Association for Social Scientific Study of Jewry. Her current book project, and this sounds so perfect and really looking forward to its publication, is called #US2, How Jewish, Muslim, and Christian Women Woke Our Communities. And I welcome Keren now. Keren, and before she speaks, I just want everyone to know that we have a chat where you could ask questions, and questions will be taken after both of our speakers have made their presentation. So please don't hesitate to write into the chat. You will also, you can also raise your hand after, and we'll try and get those questions in as well. Welcome, Keren McGinty.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that introduction, and truly for inviting me. I'm grateful to your whole committee for responding to the movement and for reaching out. We began planning this a long time ago, before these uncertain times even began. So I'm grateful to you for sticking with it, and to Jeremy for continuing this good work, and Justin for coordinating all the technology. I want to emphasize that this could be triggering for some people, and I just want to acknowledge that and say that if anyone would like to contact me after the presentation to engage in a conversation privately, then I'm more than open to doing that. Pursuing justice and pursuing it justly is one of Judaism's core obligations. In the Torah, it is written, "Justice, justice you shall pursue." That's Deuteronomy 16:20. And yet how does one pursue justice? Especially when the perpetrator of sexual misconduct and abuse of power is held up on a communal pedestal. How does one call out a man's egregious behavior, or anyone's egregious behavior, when one has been socially brainwashed, in my case, to be a nice, straight Jewish girl, Jewish woman, to be polite, accommodating, smart, but not too smart? This month marks the 3-year anniversary of the beginning of the global Me Too movement that began with a Twitter storm in October 2017. That was preceded, it must be emphasized, by the activist Tarana Burke, who coined the phrase Me Too, way back actually in 2006. For that reason, I'd like to dedicate this talk to all survivors of all genders of sexual harassment and assault. Now, as a feminist scholar and gender historian by training, I've long believed that the personal is political. My activism in this particular movement, however, was not something I sought out. Rather, it was something that, as a Jewish American woman who believes in social justice, I was compelled to do. This morning, my story begins actually by outlining the negative narrative about intermarriage and Jewish identity that I encountered when I first entered the field of Jewish studies more than 2 decades ago. I will then briefly share some of my own research and analysis about intermarried Jewish women and men. And finally, I'll illustrate the relationship between the two and specifically my personal experience speaking truth to power. So what is the Jewish response to the Me Too movement? Or what should it be? In the Me Too era, it is imperative to look at Jewish continuity with fresh eyes. Male leaders in the Jewish community who have been identified as sexual predators and abusers of power created a continuity crisis, erected harmful boundaries about who is in and who is out, excluding people who didn't fit their ideas about good Jews and the model Jewish family. Now, before I continue, I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my visuals, and I hope that I will also still be with you here. Let's do this. All right. There. I think that was successful. Let me know if not. Now, the cultural narrative about intermarriage has been, was socially constructed, and therefore it can be reconstructed using gender and change over time to better serve Jewish communities and Jewish peoplehood. To be very clear what I mean by gender, I mean the roles attributed to the sexes and the power dynamic between them, and not identity, not sexual identity. In other words, who does what inside the home as well as out, and why. I'll also be using the word Gentile in a purely neutral way to signify someone who happens to be of another faith or cultural background other than Jewish. Now, from biblical times to the present day, Jews have been warned against matrimonial alliances outside the faith, lest it spell their ultimate demise. The Hebrew Standard in 1905 warned against marriage with people who were not Jewish. The newspaper clamored, because the Jew must remain a Jew. That emphasis was in the original. And the assumption was that, by Jewish advocates and commentators at the time, was that someone who intermarried had essentially forsaken their Jewishness. Their Jewish identity was no longer important to them and would never be so. This was a very tenacious assumption, and so much so that in 1997, the distinguished law professor Alan Dershowitz, in his book, The Vanishing American Jew, wrote, quote, "A decision by a young Jewish man or woman to marry a non-Jew is generally a reflection of a well-established reality that their Jewishness is not all that central to their identity," end quote. The ad campaign in Israel, including audio urging Israelis to report on diaspora Jews on the brink of intermarriage, illustrates that the equation of intermarriage with loss to the Jewish people is not limited to the United States. Now, since the 1990 National Jewish Population Study, the focus on intermarriage patterns has received more attention in the Jewish media than any other subtopic about American Jewish life, which you can see illustrated here in the far left column. News headlines perpetuated the utterly unrealistic idea that intermarriage is something to be prevented at all costs, as if, unlike the weather, it could be controlled. The Pew Portrait of Jewish Americans, released in October 2013, unleashed a slew of negative analyses with few exceptions. Who did communal research influence the narrative about intermarriage and identity? The now disgraced sociologist Stephen M. Cohen stoked the fires of fear about Jewish discontinuity with his oft-quoted comment, which appeared here in USA Today. Quote, "Intermarriage does indeed constitute the greatest single threat to Jewish continuity today," end quote. I'll just add that I was also quoted or interviewed by the reporter for this particular article, along with others in which Cohen was quoted, and yet it's Cohen's quote that people recall and have repeated many, many times. And I would venture to say that many people, including perhaps some who are participating today, have never even heard of me, which is fine. However, by focusing on the Jews who were presumed to be lost to the Jewish people, disaffiliated from the community, and not enrolling their children in Jewish educational programs, Cohen and his co-authors made intermarriage into the communal lightning rod. Journalists went back to the same sources. Cohen repeated the negative news cycle. Now, I want to just share the work of a colleague of mine, Jennifer Thompson, who's written a wonderful book called Jewish on Their Own Terms, and also an article that appeared in the Journal of Jewish Identity that I edited. And in this graph that she created, you can see that Stephen M. Cohen, I want to emphasize, not to malign any of the Stephen Cohens out there who don't have the middle initial M, that he was cited, quoted the most times. I also want to point out that sadly, two of the social scientists here, Egon Meyer and Gary Tobin, may their memories be for blessings, died prematurely. So there really was little pushback. But at the same time, when journalists go back to the same source rather than looking for other sources, the same information gets relayed. The continuity crisis narrative held Jewish communal consciousness in a vice grip, keeping in the shadow other scholarship that being Jewish remains a vibrant identification to someone who intermarries, or that it could become such in due course, that intermarriage could actually add Jews rather than subtract them, and that there can be multi-ethnic, multiracial children of intermarriage who are 100% Jewish, as this NPR headline noted, and as the wonderful work of sociologists Helen Kim and Noah Levitt illustrate in their book, Jewasian. It's no wonder, then, that the high-profile marriages, such as Mark Zuckerberg's, caused such angst in the organized Jewish community. How did we lose him? Headlined the foreword just days after the wedding. And the gendered undertone smacks of judgment against intermarried Jewish men and pays no heed to Zuckerberg's personal life as a Jewish father, depicted here introducing his child to water and eventually swimming, and in a Facebook post of his own, giving his grandfather's Kiddush cup to his child and apparently celebrating, observing Shabbat. Nor does it recognize what Mark Mazvinsky, married to Chelsea Clinton, may be doing, photographed here not only at their wedding under a chuppah and with ketubah, but also preparing to get into a car, perhaps on their way to a Seder, with their daughter Charlotte holding what appears to be a copy of Sammy Spider's First Passover. And I would venture to guess a couple of frog plague straws sticking out of his front pocket. In order to prevent a negative self-fulfilling prophecy by alienating Jews and those who love them, and to fully reconstruct the narrative about Jewish intermarriage, scholars, journalists, and communal leaders need to illuminate how intermarriage can work, can add Jews, that Judaism is appealing enough to attract partners of other backgrounds, and that Jewish peoplehood and American Jewish life are sufficiently expansive to include them. So my research on Jewish intermarriage looks at the relationship between religion and gender and change over time to identify patterns and better understand the power dynamics within heterosexual marriages. Some of the work I look forward to doing with the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, when I begin November 1st, is helping congregations better understand the influences of, for one thing, thriving political and social liberalism that began in the 1960s and 1970s, feminism, Jewish feminism in particular, and ethnic consciousness, the rise of ethnic consciousness that contributed to intermarried Jewish women becoming considerably more proactive about making Jewish connections, about observance, and about Jewish education later in the 20th century and into the 21st. So much so, in fact, that a woman who had not become a B'nai Mitzvah, well, she had become, but she hadn't actually celebrated becoming a bat mitzvah at the age of 12 or 13, had a double bat mitzvah with her daughter. And another woman who was raised really in a secular Jewish household, sharing with me that her family never observed Shabbat in any way. And after she intermarried and had children, began lighting Shabbos candles on a weekly basis. And it was her parents who accused her of becoming a religious fanatic. Now, I'll also be educating about how, while Jewish women illustrate some of American women's gains toward equality with men, such as greater education and employment opportunities, they also demonstrate the tenacity of gendered behaviors when it came to domesticity and religion. Intermarried Jewish women consistently had careers and more responsibility for child rearing and domestic religion than did their Gentile husbands. So by voluntarily doing all of the necessary planning and most of the physical labor involved in religious observance and cultural participation, they thereby reinforced the social expectation of women as the purveyors of Judaism that was increasingly practiced in the home in addition to or instead of the synagogue. So where does that leave intermarried Jewish men? And is the upside or the silver lining of being an intermarried Jewish man the downside of being an intermarried, the upside of being an intermarried Jewish woman, the downside of being an intermarried Jewish man? Well, we haven't really known much about intermarried Jewish men. They're the Hollywood moguls, including the Warner brothers, who married non-Jewish women after marrying Jewish women. The Kushner brothers, of course, and their beloveds, both of whom became Jewish before they wed. There's a slew of fictional representations on the silver screen and sociological studies illustrating a gender imbalance in religious and communal life. The tabloids, reality TV have gotten into the interfaith act, highlighting The Bachelor, The Bachelorette's Jewish heritage. And there's also, of course, pop culture. There's Curb Your Enthusiasm, which we could have a whole morning discussion about. And there's also a 2-minute clip from Sex and the City that I'd like to share with you right now.
What's all this?
Well, since it's our first Shabbos together, I wanted to make it a little special.
A little? This is phenomenal.
I just need to get the candles and then we can say the bracha.
Carlos Silva now in the Philly bullpen. Roland pinches in at third. Cedeno squares, Bonds foul.
Oh, come on.
He was sacrificing. He was trying to drop one down as though he was...
Honey, please turn that off. We're about to eat.
Good looking play at all.
Smells incredible. And you made brisket. I cannot believe you made brisket.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Shabbat. Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos, sweetie. I cannot believe you made all this. What did I do to deserve you?
I feel the same way. I've been thinking about blessings, and you are such a blessing to me. Why is the TV on?
It's on mute.
Mute? Mute? We're having Shabbos dinner.
It's a big game, honey.
Turn it off. I want you to turn it off right this minute.
But it's...
Off now.
Let me just watch this one pitch.
I gave up Christ for you, and you can't give up the Mets?
It's going to be a long life if you keep that up. I gave up Christ for you. Take out the trash. I gave up Christ for you. Pick up your socks.
There's so much in that 2 minutes. And I encourage you to discuss with friends and family. We can come back to it perhaps during the Q&A if there's time. But much of my work tries to, and I hope dismantles many of those stereotypes and myths. But it's really studying the hearts and minds and experiences and behaviors of intermarried Jewish men in the post-World War II period, 1945 to present, and change over time that allows us to better understand Jewish intermarriage and fatherhood, and incorporating Christian women's voices in the new narrative on intermarriage to understand how these women of valor have also influenced the Jewish story. I've detected the patterns that will help inform how the conservative movement can navigate its way forward and transform the meaning of intermarriage to better enable intermarried Jewish men to raise Jewish children equally effectively as intermarried Jewish women. Because a crucial issue regarding intermarriage is how children are raised and what that means for the future of the Jewish people and Jewish continuity. Now, the fact that, let's see. There we go. The fact that the proportion of adult Jews with intermarried parents has increased is a direct reflection, of course, of the increase in the rate of intermarriage over time from less than 17% among Jews who married before 1970 to 58% among Jews who married in 2000 or later. Unfortunately, Pew also affords us another way of looking at the children of intermarriage. From the older to the younger generations, the proportion of adult children of intermarriage identifying as Jewish in any way steadily increased, from the baby boomers to Generation Xers to the millennials, as you see in the far left column, 61% combined. And Jewish education, camping, and birthright have all had a tremendously positive influence. The 2015 study, Millennial Children of Intermarriage, found that most of the respondents who participated in birthright identified as Jewish. To put another way, controlling for gender and the gender of the Jewish parent, millennials who are the children of intermarriage are nearly 3 times as likely to have been raised exclusively as Jews as were older generations. But there's a gender rub here, which is that extant scholarship about children of intermarriage contends that more Jewish children are raised by Jewish mothers married to Gentile fathers than Jewish fathers married to Gentile mothers. And this research is rather nascent, and there's much more research to do, but there are these 3 studies that have illustrated what I just said effectively, and something that needs to be addressed as we move forward. In other words, gender matters. While intermarried Jewish men may help broaden the concept of continuity, traditional gender behaviors continue to influence American Jewish life, including men's available time for parenting. And while the idea of the dual career couple has evolved, and the idea of equal parenting has begun to take root, what historians discuss as the new fatherhood in the 1970s and 1980s that really legitimized men spending more time with their children and doing more than, say, changing a few diapers, it didn't fully reconstruct gender relations in terms of domestic or paid labor to create any kind of real equity. And that extends even into the present, 2020. And when I asked men how they envision their role as a man, as a husband, as a father, many men responded with the words, to provide. Now, and that's in addition, I want to emphasize with characteristics such as hardworking and financially successful, family-oriented, committed to helping others and setting a good example. But the point is that being a provider was still their primary role. Like the women that Betty Friedan described in her book, The Feminine Mystique, Jewish men suffer from what was previously an unnamed malady. In Marrying Out, my second book on Jews, gender, and intermarriage, I call it the Jewish masculine mystique. In their case, however, it stems from competing priorities and communal disenfranchisement rather than overeducated and underutilized minds. Men are really caught between wanting to make the world a better place and the American rules of masculinity that encourage them to win, to get ahead, to make more money, to have bigger houses, to buy more toys. Intermarried Jewish men's struggle to shape their own sense of fatherhood is part of the larger ongoing movement in America to encourage men to become more involved parents. When he was in office, President Obama launched a national dialogue about fatherhood. And he emphasized that, in his own words, which I can't even begin to, to capture his voice, things can get busy and sometimes we all fall short, but the smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today. A redefinition of manhood and masculinity is part of a Jewish response to the Me Too movement. We need to end all patriarchal systems and structures of oppression that make Jewish women and many others who have been historically marginalized second-class citizens. The day that my op-ed was published, calling on the American Jewish community to address sexual harassment and assault within our faith community, Stephen M. Cohen knew his time as a serial sexual predator was up. He was nearly immediately excommunicated from academic life. As the United Jewish Appeal, the New York Federation announced they had worked with him in the past and would no longer. He was disinvited from coming to the Brandeis campus. His membership in the Association for Jewish Studies and the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry were suspended, and the Title IX investigation concluded in his resignation under duress. I want to emphasize only when many more women came out of the woodwork from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. What we need to remember about the quantitative, data-driven, and negative narrative about Jewish continuity, and this is where I'm really trying to bring together the Jewish response to Me Too as well as the negative narrative about intermarriage, is that Cohen propelled it in a context. What my colleagues Lila Corwin Berwin, Ronit Stahl, and Kay Rosenblatt wrote, describing as, quote, patriarchal, misogynistic, and anachronistic assumptions about what is good for the Jews, end quote. That outdated conversation targeted single Jews, queer Jews, unwed Jews with children, and childless individuals or couples as counter to continuity or otherwise problematic. This worldview previously set the Jewish communal agenda. In a forthcoming volume of the journal American Jewish History, these same authors clearly illuminate that a scholar's academic and communal contributions cannot be separated from their personal behavior. They reveal the construction and tenacity of the continuity paradigm and its deep entrenchment in the politics of Jewish social science research and communal policy setting. In my response to their essay in the same forthcoming volume, I identify Stephen Cohen as the loudest contributor to what they identified as the continuous feedback loop, a relentless and domineering voice of the continuity paradigm. Thus, that much of his research was funded by a man similarly responsible for sexual harassment should not be surprising. Now, what can we do? What else can we do? Well, first, it's imperative that everyone do their part to end sexual misconduct and abuses of power in the Jewish communal work and sacred spaces. And these are just a few examples of the organizations and ideas working toward that goal. Ally is a verb, the Safety, Respect, and Equity Network, Sacred Spaces, Talmud, Transforming Jewish Workplaces, and a wonderful archiving project by the Jewish Women's Archive. Second, we must put a much greater emphasis on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our work. This is meant to illustrate that, but there are certainly many more visuals that one could use. And we must fully recognize that same-sex marriage, same-sex interfaith marriage is part of the Jewish story. And there's much more research that needs to be done in this particular area. My own work has focused on heterosexual marriages between Jewish men and women of other faith backgrounds, and Jewish women and men of other faith backgrounds. But what about same-sex interfaith marriage? We know very, very little. Finally, we must complete the unfinished business of the sexual revolution and make gender equality a reality. Enabling intermarried Jewish men to better integrate work and family is a feminist goal that will benefit all sexes. The issue of men's Jewish parenting and communal participation need to be looked at in their fuller context. Active Jewish fathering needs to be seen as equally important as providing. Gender will persist in influencing the disproportionately low transmission rate of Jewish identity to children of intermarried Jewish men compared to intermarried Jewish women, so long as men's work continues to be socially valued more highly than women's work, and men's identities continue to be fashioned by what they do rather than who they are. The future is truly here, and our Jewish response must be to pivot from the intermarriage as assimilation narrative, associated hand-wringing, looking beyond religious syncretism theories and protectors of the Jewish establishment status quo about core and periphery, to the actual experiences of intermarried couples and their families, as well as to unwed Jews, single Jewish parents, queer Jews, and parents of singletons. Words matter. They can be used to reiterate outdated conclusions, or they can be used to accurately depict the full spectrum of Jewish pluralism and diversity. The Jewish people will grow, and the future will be even more vibrant than it is today if we build communities that are not only pluralistic and inclusive, but also emphasize that love is love and that egalitarian parenting is a Jewish value. That is the ultimate response to the Me Too movement. Let's optimize the opportunity so that one of the legacies of #Gamani, the Jewish Me Too movement, is a new narrative about how someone who intermarries is still Jewish, to generate a self-fulfilling prophecy of American Jewish life that includes all Jews and their loved ones, in which all gender identities are treated B'Tselem Elohim, in God's image, equally with dignity and respect. Thank you, and now I'm going to turn back to my host to introduce our next speaker.
Hey, Susan, you're on mute.
I'm talking and I'm muted. There's so much there, and I have so many questions already. And I just want to remind everyone to please put your questions in the chat, and we'll bring them up later. And I will now introduce Dr. Paul Nahme, who is the DeRote Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies and an Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Brown University. From 2019 to 20, he was a Star Fellow in Judaica at Harvard. He received his PhD from the University of Toronto. In addition, and this is how I found out about Dr. Nahme, he is a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America and part of its Gender Equality Institute. He is currently working on a book project, Jewish Racial Affect and the Role That Race Has Played in Jewish Self-Conception. As a research fellow at Shalom Hartman Institute, he analyzes how definitions of manhood are dependent on cultural contexts and asks how we might reflect on what masculinity has come to mean in Western society today. Welcome, Dr. Nahme.
Thank you so much, Susan. And thank you for the invitation to speak to the congregation. Thank you, Jeremy, as well, and Justin for the tech. And thank you, Keren, for an exceptional presentation. That's a really, I have a lot of questions and thoughts as well, but I'm going to try and also save those for after I speak. So in a sense, what I want to do is, I think in some sense, heed part of the call that I think Keren is issuing, which is, I think, the ethical requirement of Jewish men in light of the Me Too movement, and that is to think about the self-examination of masculinity and to really dive into that. And the way I want to do that today is by means of something of a historical turn to thinking about the shaping of modern Jewish masculinity. What are the, as Susan rightly said, the cultural context, the historical context that we might want to better understand as a way of understanding how Jewish men in the 19th century in particular imagine themselves into the gender role of masculinity that they played, whether or not they were thinking consciously about gender as a construct. I mean, that's not, I don't think that was the case. I think we can theorize it now in the light of gender theory, which I'll say a few words about what that means. And then I want to provide a window into two, what I guess you could call typologies. Really, there are two historical types of masculinity that emerged in the 19th century that I'm particularly interested in. One is from the misconduct tradition, the Lithuanian Talmudic tradition that gave rise to, I think, what many folks today would think of most readily as a kind of ultra-Orthodox Jewish man. And I also want to think of the sort of model of masculinity that emerged almost simultaneously in Hasidic literature of the same period. So just to be clear, what I'm really trying to do is think about some conditions in the 19th century that led to a certain shaping of masculinity. I want to look at two types of masculinity to understand what was available for Jewish men in the 19th century and to better understand how that might condition the way we understand today certain forms of Jewish masculinity. But my goal is not to hold those up as abstract types that should be pursued. I want to be very clear. My goal is to critically engage with the limitations of those models, and therefore to also ask what might still be latent in those models that we could dig into today as contemporary folks wanting to think about masculine male allyship with Jewish women, and to better think about, again, as Keren rightly said, how allyship should be a verb. To be an ally should mean that we are doing the work of self-examination, of requiring ourselves to think about what it means to be a human being, to be a member of a community, to be a man, to be a member of a family unit, to be a member of a social unit of any sort. And so in some sense, what I'm doing is a combination of some historical work and then a little bit of Jewish thought work, which is to say the kind of theorizing, philosophizing about what it might mean to understand the sort of rabbinic adage, mishaneh et atzmo, mishaneh et haolam, change yourself, change the world. So I'm going to now just move to some context for all of this. So the first thing right off the bat, and I'm going to be sharing my screen periodically so you can see my sources that I'm going to be looking at, and then I'm going to turn the share screen feature off at times. So it might be a little, my face suddenly coming into the fore and then disappearing. So I apologize for the low-tech version of this, but it works in some form instead of having everyone like having a sheet in front of them. Also, I have two screens, so if you see my eyes go here, it's not because I'm distracted by something else. It's that the camera is here, and then my source sheet is over here. So it's going to be a little awkward, but I hope everyone will bear with me. So the first thing I want to say is basically when we're talking about masculinity, here comes my first share of the screen. I'm hoping, oh, that's not it. Here we go. Can you see the detoxing masculinity? Yes? Great. So when we're talking about masculinity, one thing that I think I want to make clear from the outset is we're also talking about a particular gender construction, a gender performed identity. And what I mean by that is not that it's the gender of Jewish masculinity is something that's not real. So when we say, for example, scholars will talk about gender construction, we're not saying it's not real. In fact, it's very real. It's socially, in an embodied way, very real, the gender identities that we fit ourselves into and we through the families we were raised in and the norms that we're exposed to in our communities that tell us here's what it means to be a good boy, here's what it means to be a good little girl. We often find ourselves performing based on that kind of normative context, what we're told we should be. So if we look, for example, at Dr. Sarah Imhoff's description in a book that I think is really fantastic, it came out in 2017, Masculinity, the Making of Modern American Judaism, she explains it very clearly in a way that I think is helpful for us. So she says, quote, gender, and this is the first right here, is not in this sense invented solely as an individual act of will. In other words, when we say gender is a performance, we're not saying that's like we wake up and we decide this is what I'm going to do now to perform this identity. Rather, we're always performing it unconsciously, whether we think of it as such as or not. So she also says, nor does it change instantaneously, right? Gender is a social construct, but it is nevertheless very socially real, durable, and powerful. Gender norms seem to be simultaneously ideals and expectations. So I think what Dr. Imhoff here is really outlining for us is a view of how there is this element of, let's say, reality, durability, the powerful nature of our identities, of who we are as we kind of interact with each other. And then there's the elements of the larger story, the historical story. How did ideas of Jewish masculinity arrive in this way? How are these norms shaped through this long durée, if you want to say history. Where did they come from? Where are these ideals that we're striving for, or the expectations that are levied, right, and that are put in front of us, like we're supposed to live up to certain ideals? Where did those come from? So that's really what we're talking about in terms of gender identity being performed or constructed. It's not fake. It's just, it has a thickness to it that doesn't stop at the individual psyche. It really goes into this larger web of expectations in the public sphere. So having said that, I want to now think about what then in the 19th century, which is the period I'm particularly studying, what were the expectations for Jewish men? The truth is, and this is something I'm working on in my current book, not a lot was expected of Jewish men in the larger European discourse of what we would call the Jewish question, the Judenfrage, right? The idea that somehow questions of whether or not Jews could be emancipated, given rights, could they ever become members of the European nation states that they were living in, was there something about Jews that was just fundamentally different? And so in the 19th century, this is a conversation that largely we recognize in sort of the rise of racial anti-Semitism as a question about race. Are the Jews Semitic and thus essentially other to the European Aryan? But it was also a discourse that intersects at very, very, very many points with certain gender constructions as well. So Jewish men were effeminized in both public, the sort of the pamphlets that you would see circulated among the sort of intellectual anti-Semites. Jewish men were often depicted as being, in some ways, this kind of third sex. Like perhaps they had both pieces of sexual anatomy of male and female. Perhaps that's part of why the Semite is this inferior racial species. Or there was the sense of this kind of caricature, which Jews themselves also internalized, which we see clearly in this next citation from Max Nordau, the great Zionist father, along with Theodor Herzl, that there's somehow a self-imposed effeminization, right? That Jews, especially in Eastern Europe, by studying Talmud all the time and making that somehow the only thing that mattered in the world, completely neglected their bodies. And so that's where we have this kind of discourse of the muscle Jew that emerges, which Nordau explains here. I won't read to you because I'm hoping you can still see the screen, and then you can see for yourself. So that's in effect the larger context in terms of Jews being in many ways, on the one hand, put into a single category, which is this third sex category, which is on the one hand, if you're in thinking about the larger European context, is a way of saying that Jews as a category, as Jewish men and Jewish women, are all essentially other. But then the ways in which that larger category is also, in effect, an effeminized category is really important. So that's why when I say there's a gender construction at stake here, it's that it's not entirely clear what non-Jews in Europe are thinking of Jews in their gender roles, and that Jews in turn in the 19th century are having to respond to this and think, okay, wait a second, what does it mean to be a Jewish man as opposed to a Jewish woman? Or what does it mean to be a Jewish man as opposed to this effeminized, whatever that means for Jews in the 19th century, but this caricature that's being, thrown around in the public sphere. So one ideal that emerges that I want to focus on is that of the Talmud scholar, the Torah scholar. And in a way, an expression of a certain kind of Jewish masculinity or a sense of Jewish self-awareness that emerges with what we now recognize as being the sort of the yeshiva movement. This begins with the founding of the yeshiva of Volozhin in around 1806. And so for those of you that had a chance to look at the video that was circulated in advance of that I had given a talk for the Hartman Institute and for Created Equal, I go into a little bit more depth there. So I'm not going to spend as much time really going into this primary sources, but I do want to put it on the table. The ideal of the Torah scholar emerges as one version or one, let's say, model of masculinity. And yet with saying that, I want to put on the table the caveat that and this is looking at this citation right here from Daniel Boyarin, that again, the Torah scholar as the sort of ideal type for the Jewish male is similarly ensconced in the patriarchal structures that we're now currently talking about as being, still part of this problem of male power being either abused or either wielded unconsciously and needing examination. So just the short citation from Boyarin, I think, really spells this out. Gender, in short, in rabbinic culture, and thus gender domination are forged via the construction of the ideal male as Torah scholar. Torah study is the functional modality by which male dominance over women is secured in rabbinic discourse. thus fulfilling the functions that physical domination secures in various other cultural formations. So really what Boyarin's saying here is that we can't pretend, we can't idealize the Torah scholar as if that's a better version of masculinity than what was available in 19th century Europe, or even in antiquity. And that's what Boyarin's book is, kind of gesturing at. Like there's continuity of this notion of Jewish masculinity as this ideal Torah scholar male. So it is similarly part of a structure of dominance. So I'm not trying to glorify it. I just want to make sure that we're clear about that. That being said, what's interesting in the modern period in the yeshiva movement is that in this context of modern Europe, similarly as a whole, coming into new ways of socially expressing identity. So we have with the rise of the Enlightenment, new notions of subjectivity, of selfhood, right? The sense of individualism that in America we hear a lot of talk about, right? Individual rights holders as being the sort of basis of, what we would think of as like essence of the human being. A lot of this is emerging in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so this veneration of the self, of the individual, is a new discourse, right? Jews who are in the 19th century similarly experiencing new, let's say, social opportunities to express themselves, whether that's as the 19th century progresses, the ability to move into urban centers, to come into more contact with non-Jews beyond the Pale of Settlement, if you're in East Europe, or if you're in Central Europe, in Austria-Hungary, or if you're in Germany, the urbanization means that Jewish men, Jewish boys really, they're finding new opportunities are available, whether to enter medical school or law school, sometimes not. Maybe they can attend a lecture. Either way, they're exposed to the fact that the social fabric of modern Europe is changing, and they're thinking about how they can become new selves, new individuals. And so in this context, the opening of the Yeshiva of Volozhin was one way that, let's say, the traditionalist rabbinical world decided to try and keep young Jews in the fold. So maybe going to Keren's work, also thinking about this question of intermarriage as a risk, or what keeps Jews in the fold. I think this is part of what was the impetus to open up the yeshivas. Like, let's give an institute of higher learning that will do the work of this kind of intellectual heavy lifting, almost like a scientific study of text. They don't have to go to secular institutions. They don't have to go to universities. Young Jews should be able to study Torah this way. And so we have just a little citation here. Again, it's long, so I'm not going to read it, but if you want to kind of glance at it, Zalman Epstein, who was a Zionist publicist and essayist, who studied in Volozhin and wrote a number of first-person narratives of his experience there, gives us a real sense of what it was like to be in the yeshiva, which is that it was seen as this kind of modern place. Like, everyone dressed really well. Everyone made sure that they had like the style of the day, whether it was with the width of the tie or whether or not it was a tiny cravat. They looked very European, and they had mores that were somewhat modeling this sense of modern European sensibility. So the reason I'm putting that there is because to then think about the yeshiva as a place where Torah study is held up above everything else as an ideal, I think it's interesting to think about is that Torah becomes this world of ideals and expectations, going back to Dr. Imhoff's description, right? That informs how some Jewish men in this period are deciding to hold themselves up to the standard and say, I want to become an ideal Torah scholar. I want to become more like these saints that are depicted in the Talmud, whether it's the Chachamim, the sages, or whether it's the Rishonim and the sort of medieval commentators, the Achronim, the ones the later modern thinkers that these students were studying with. They wanted to feel that kind of ideal as it shaped them. And so there's one quote here I will read because I think it spells it out quite well. And this is from Rabbi Yosef Dovber Halevi Soloveitchik, not the Soloveitchik who's well known, but his namesake, his great-great-great-grandfather, the Beis Halevi, as he was known, who was one of the Rosh Yeshiva, the heads of the Academy of Volozhin. And his description of Torah study, I think, is very metaphysical, but it's very interesting because I think it represents a window into this. So here you'll see this citation here. The reason for this kind of, he has a model of the holiness of Talmud study as becoming part of the holiness of the person. That's what he's explaining here. So the reason for this is that the Talmid Chacham is not considered the vessel of holiness, and it's not it's a part of the tashmishe kedusha, like you would say, like boxes for tefillin are considered vessels for holiness, but the tefillin themselves are considered the kind of etzem hakadusha, the essence of kedusha. He's using that as a parallel, and he says the Talmid Chacham is not a vessel, but is the essence of holiness, the etzem hakadusha, as it can be explained from Orach Chaim. Actually, this citation is not correct, but that's fine. The parchment upon which, and this is the analogy he's making, just as the parchment upon which the Sefer Torah is written is not a vessel of holiness, but the essence of holiness. Similarly, the body of the Talmid Chacham becomes the parchment of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah. As it is written, you write them upon the tablet of your heart. So the Talmid Chacham, the one who's studying Torah, becomes transformed in this ideal of holiness. That was the kind of model that was held out in the misconduct tradition, right? This is to say the non-mystical, the non-Hasidic tradition of orthodoxy emerging in Eastern Europe. And that was the goal, to train students to be as sharp intellectually as they could be, but also that intellectual labor was a kind of attempt to make themselves holy. So there are obvious limitations with that, many of which we know in a sort of popular sense of the limitations of a certain kind of orthodoxy. The one I'll point out in particular is a more one that I've seen firsthand just in the yeshiva culture. It can create a sense of veneration of selfhood, right? I want to be the Talmid Chacham, singular. I want to be the sharpest. I want to outwit those others, my chavrutot, the people I study with. I want to be better than. And so now we see this kind of dual-sided, I think it's, let's say, the sort of the short, let's say, short-sightedness of this ideal, which is to say that by pursuing this notion of Talmud Torah, learning Torah is the only thing one should strive for, it actually can exclude all other aspects of being an embodied human being because you're dwelling in the supernal realm alone. And by demonstrating your mastery, it's also a potential reassertion of power, right? The power you wield as the knowledgeable Talmud scholar. So that, in effect, speaks back to what Daniel Boyarin's trying to tell us. This is still, in effect, part of the patriarchal structure. But another model that I think we should pay attention to is that what we find in the Hasidic tradition. So Hasidism, beginning largely with the Baal Shem Tov, as many of you know, who lived between roughly 1698 and 1760, was a tradition that was at its very beginning thoroughly rebellious against the sort of standards of not this version of rabbinic Judaism, obviously, because it comes a little bit later, that the institution of the yeshiva, but the notion that either the opportunities to be a truly pious Jewish man required you to be ascetic, to deny the body, to deny yourself pleasures of any sort, to fast constantly. So we have lots of accounts of ascetic practices in the 17th century where these great Kabbalist thinkers would fast from Shabbat to Shabbat, and they would only try to eat on Shabbat. And that would be the day where they would allow themselves a kind of bodily experience because they got this other nefesh, this other part of their soul with Shabbat. So the holiness was in effect sustained. But it's a lot of self-denial. And the Baal Shem Tov famously preached a model of mysticism that was much more about this world, about the elements of this world and of being a person in this world that would be the locations to find inspiration and find holiness. And so one thing that's really interesting that emerges in the discourse of Hasidism is a language of what's called tikkun hamidot, the sort of rectification of your attributes or traits. And the tikkun hamidot language is interesting because I think what we see in Hasidism, inspired by the Baal Shem Tov, is a turn towards this kind of psychological reflection on what it means to be a Jewish man. And I mean that in a much stronger sense, I think, than what we see in the yeshiva culture. And so here's one source I want to read a little bit in full because I think it's really revealing, which is the Me'orei Naim. So this is one of the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, writing and very much inspired by the Baal Shem Tov, one of the major sources for texts we then kind of assign to the Baal Shem Tov. And here's the lovely translation of Rabbi Arthur Green. So the Me'orei Naim, Rabbi Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl, says the following. It says, "We humans are dressed in physical bodily form. How could these divine qualities, these midot, be awakened in such as us? How could we be aroused to love our blessed Creator in a truly pure way, or to stand in awe of God or of any of the rest? Our physical nature would not allow us to awaken to such spiritual ways. That is why the Shem Hashem brought his qualities down into physical form, including the love of worldly pleasures or our fear of outward things, punishments, or just the way we humans are afraid of one another. The divine midot descended rung after rung, each following the one before it. This is part of the cosmic Kabbalist understanding of the creation of the world through the sfirot. So the midot are these sfirot, like, chesed and gevura, justice and strength, or charity and strength, or kind of like softening of din, of the strength of judgment. These are all the midot that we find in ourselves, according to the Meor Einayim. And he's saying that there's a way in which, as it descends into the physical self, that we as human beings have to do a certain amount of work of reflecting on this kind of continuity between divine midot and physical human midot. But one thing that's really interesting here, and again, emphasizing that Hasidism is a fundamentally masculine phenomenon. There are women on the peripheries, but their voices are not included largely in the sort of institutionalization of Hasidism in its grounding moments in the middle of the 18th century. But there's still a turn here to naming something about the Jewish man as having to dwell in this physical body and recognize that desire and attachment to worldly things is part of what makes you a human being. It's what makes you a Jewish man. And then the work that has to be done, as the Meor Einayim explains, again, if you want to look at the text in full, I'm happy to send it along after, but as you can see, it's quite long. There's a work that goes into this kind of rectification of trying to work on your midot to make sure that the temptation is not to fall into, and this becomes a very explicit language in Hasidism, a kind of lusting after the corporeal, of lusting after bodily desire and longing. Instead, the same language of longing and desire gets refracted through this lens of desire for the holy. So terms such as ga'agua or hishtokakot, the chukah, like this notion of actual, we would use in modern Hebrew as like a certain sense of like sexual longing has to be channeled up towards the divine. Now, one of the things that obviously, again, is a limitation of this kind of discourse is that you see that there's a certain kind of objectification. Here, I'm actually going to stop sharing so that I can not scroll, everyone get confused by that. There's an objectification of the particular sexual object, namely the unspoken dimension of woman, right? So the Jewish woman becomes, in some sense, an object in this discourse. So we have this shortcoming, which is why, again, I'm also not trying to hold this up as another ideal or model. But what I do want to think about is how a certain model of self-reflection emerges in the Hasidic tradition that's similar or parallels that in the misconduct tradition, the yeshiva tradition that we were talking about. And that is to say, to think about how those ideals and expectations that derive from the study of Torah should shape the kinds of selves that we Jewish men should become. And that pursuit, I think, requires, and this is the key that I'm really trying to draw out, that notion of self-reflection that I think is very modern, as I said before, like with the emergence of this new idea of the self or the individual in larger European discourses of philosophy or politics, law. I think we're seeing a similar element here in the Hasidic and the misconduct tradition of a need for self-reflection and probity, to dig deep into ourselves and understand what it means to truly be a Jewish man. Now, one thing that's interesting, again, I'm going to share my screen again, so again, forgive the somewhat back and forth, but there's a very interesting citation here from Rabbi Nahme of Breslov, who is perhaps one of the most well-known of the Hasidic Rebbeim, the Rebbes of the 18th century, and I guess really he dies in 1810, so technically, or the turn of the century, let's say, into the 19th century, who is in many ways known as being very explicit about one particular dimension of self-reflection, and that's to say the temptation of masculine sexuality in particular. So with Tikkun HaKlali, the sort of general rectification is often seen as Rabbi Nachman's answer to this question of temptation in the modern world. But one thing he says in this text, and this is Torah, I believe 31, yeah, so the text here towards the bottom, he says something quite interesting that I thought would be worth reading out loud. So he says that there are basically two covenants. He's giving a reading of a parsha in the Torah, and he's saying that there's one element of the covenant that God makes with Israel is based on Torah, Sheba'al Peh, right? This kind of the idea of the oral law. And that Rabbi Nachman reads in the following way. He says, this is the meaning of educate the youth al pi, in line with his way, specifically al pi, that is to say Torah sheba'al peh, the oral law. And the upper covenant is guarding the brit. So this is the second covenant, which is to say that sense of the brit kodesh, which can be read as two ways: the brit, the covenant God makes with Israel, but also the brit as in hatafat dam brit, which is to say like the symbol of the blood of circumcision. And that becomes a way of also kind of telegraphing this notion of sexual desire. And he says this, so the upper covenant is guarding the brit, while the lower covenant is keeping the laws of the forbidden and permitted, isur veheter. A person has to possess both these levels. It really is, it's a man, an ish, but a person has to possess both these levels of the covenant. That is, he has to both be a tzaddik and a lamdan, a scholar. For an unlearned person cannot be a saint. He is called a tzaddik through guarding the holy brit, and a scholar through guarding the forbidden and the permitted, isur veheter. So here we see Nahme of Breslov saying very explicitly, you need the elements to be a Jewish man. You need to be able to do the work of learning what is permitted and forbidden. You need to study Torah, and you need to guard your body from being tempted by whatever that form of desire that becomes physical. You need to rectify it and make it a higher form of desire for holiness, for God. Now, okay, so I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to keep going, which I very well could, as we all know, like, right? You know, academics, we could talk forever. But one thing I wanted to share with you was this reflection. I've mentioned that I think both of these models have severe limitations because of the way that A, they're obviously addressed to men only, and B, they're addressing men to the exclusion of women, which of course in turn objectifies women as if they are only vehicles of temptation. I think that this tradition, the Hasidic tradition in particular, has had interpretations in the contemporary world that are, I think, making certain negotiations of the more, what I think are, let's say, the parts of these texts or traditions that still have potential for the kind of self-reflection, I think that they are really calling for, without the need to continue to sort of, circulate misogyny as if it were, part of Torah. I firmly believe that that is not the case. And I think that there is a way to read these texts so that you can overcome misogyny. But what I wanted to do is leave us with a very contemporary example. So I don't know, for those of you, I happen to be an avid follower of Israeli hip hop, and I listen to a lot of different artists. And I've noticed that in the last couple of years, one particular producer, singer, songwriter who's produced a lot of the sort of important acts in Israeli hip hop, a guy by the name of Atar Meiner, has, since the beginning of COVID, stopped producing tracks or singing about the standard fare of, what we'd see in like American hip hop, which is money, crime being okay and misogyny being okay. And instead, not that he's saying about that explicitly, but he stopped producing others who were doing that. And since COVID set in, he had this Instagram post where he was basically saying, like, we're living in a moment that requires a completely different kind of music. And he wrote this song that basically channels some of what I think we find in the Me'orei Naim and in Rabbi Nachman. And I wanted to share it with you. It's called Lehitorer, which can mean to become awoken, or to be woke, really, to wake up. And it also is, in a way, a narrative about someone who's trying to negotiate what it means to become a better person. But as you'll see, I want you to listen to the song, but you'll see there's something about it that I find it's resonant, and it perhaps reveals a contemporary model of a kind of Jewish, here Israeli, but Jewish masculinity that's a little bit more vulnerable, a little more self-reflexive, and maybe is a step in the right direction. But I'll leave that to you to decide. So I'm gonna end with the song, and I'll scroll down as we listen to it, if that's okay. So I hope please tell me if you can hear the. Okay, let me just take my headphones out so you can actually hear. Okay. Can you hear that? So I'll scroll down so you can read the lyrics as you're hearing him say them.
שוכח שהגוף הזה לרגע והנשמה לנצח, אפשר לרפא את הפצע, אני משחרר את המתח, כל החרא שעברתי עולה כמו מדליה, כל הפחד שנשאר בי אני שם אותו על אבא, כל מי שאהבתי אני אוהב אותו עדיין, מרים את הידיים, עוצם את העיניים, רוצה להתעורר בן אדם אחר, בעולם אחר, יפה יותר, יפה יותר, רוצה להתעורר בן אדם אחר, בעולם אחר, יפה יותר, יפה יותר.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I won't play the whole entirety of it. But I think there's a way in which we even see a certain model here of a different kind of masculinity. I just noting the line, all the fear that's left in me, I put it all on Abba. Like, in other words, a sense of like the displacement of responsibility that I think he's trying to negotiate. And he ends with this claim, right? I want to wake up and be a new person. I want to wake up in a world that's more beautiful. I want to be a more beautiful person. I want to live in a world that's more beautiful. And then he gets explicit in the second verse where he actually says like ha'ikar ze lo lefached, which is, you know, Rabbi Nachman's famous line, the key is not to be afraid, and liftoch b'Hashem, to trust in God, which is very strange for Atalmina. None of his fans thought he was religious. So there's something there that's being renegotiated that I think, again, speaks to the kind of the potent dimension of some of these sources. But again, I want to end with that caveat of saying, I think the point is that there's a responsibility that Jewish men today really need to like take part in actively, of examining how we think of ourselves. What are the expectations that are being levied upon us from the larger culture we live in? What are the expectations we might be able to find in our tradition that could help us become better allies to women, become better, more self-reflexive, more thoughtful partners? So I'll stop there, but thank you so much for the time, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Susan, you're on mute again.
Got it. We have some questions written down, so I'll ask those people to, I'll call on them first, and I have some questions, and I'm sure that other people do. So if you could go into the chat and raise your hand, or else it maybe Justin could look and see if anybody's got their hand raised, then I'll call on them with their questions. The first question's from Mark Gordon. Mark, could you ask your question, please?
Sure. Thank you, Susan. I appreciate the shout out in your introduction. This is.
Oh, thank you for bringing it.
Yeah, I've got a background issue here. Wait, let me just change the background. Okay. This is the article that Susan referenced in the introduction. It is about Me Too, and it lists all the people that were initially cited in the first few months of it. And what struck me was the number of Jewish people on the list. You have Harvey Weinstein, Dustin Hoffman, Jeff Tambor, Louis C.K., Al Franken, Charlie Rose, Matt Lauer, who has a Jewish father, David Copperfield, Steve Wynn, Leslie Moonves, Jeffrey Epstein, Alan Dershowitz, who is mentioned. All of these prominent Jewish men had abused or mistreated women. And the question for our speakers is, why are so many Jewish men among the people cited in the early Me Too movement? Why aren't Jews more a minority of that group?
I'd be happy to offer a couple thoughts on that, if I may. Okay. Well, you know, until someone does a deep dive. I don't know that we can say conclusively, but I have a couple of ideas. I think the first, with regard to the overrepresentation of Jewish men, I think it's important to recognize that Jews, as much as we are a drop in the bucket as far as the population is concerned, we are overrepresented in specific areas. And, the same can be said for when there are positive things, awards given, medical recognition for breakthroughs, and why are there so many, Jewish doctors involved. So I think there's an overrepresentation of Jewish men in the media, in the music business, in Hollywood, and so forth. There's a book, The Jews Made Hollywood. So in other words, keep that in mind, the overrepresentation. The other thing is that, and this is based on my own research about Jewish men and about gender specifically, is that while Jews in America have proved themselves as Americans, I believe that Jewish men are still proving themselves as men. So, which is unfortunate for all of the reasons, but I believe that this ties in directly with some of what Paul was just teaching us about in terms of navigating a wound, whether it's a mother wound or a father wound, and not having learned to guard their own bodies. But instead being caught up in the social construction of gender, which is part of the larger American context. Okay, so it's not, Jews are not functioning in a vacuum. That in American society teaches women don't get raped, right? American society doesn't teach men don't rape. It teaches women to not get raped. So there are so many things that are frankly wrong and upside down and inside out that have to do with the much larger context. So I believe that Jewish men have been, proving themselves, and part of proving themselves, unfortunately, has been, having that conquest, the notches in their belts. How many women can they, etc. Those are my thoughts. Paul, do you have more you'd like to add?
I think you said it perfectly well. The only thing I would add is that I think what I notice in that list is also the degree to which there's a number of what we would say like acculturated, assimilated, less observant Jews, which is not to say it's a cause, but the question I think Keren's describing is really significant of not yet perfected becoming a man, or not yet the model of the American male is part of that story for sure. And I think the other side of it is a certain kind of a sense of like embarrassment or fear about what other Jewish forms of masculinity might be haunting these same men. And so to overcome that, there's in a sense an overcompensation perhaps of like, I need to prove my virility as a man. And I think that, so there's a lot more to say, but I actually think, Keren, you said it quite well. So I'm going to just stop and leave it at that.
Am I muted? No. Louis Peels.
Hi, Susan. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think I first want to thank both Paul and Keren for, Paul, you said something as you thought your time was waning and said academics could go on. But what strikes me more about both of you as academics is your passion. And I don't want that to be lost, that as rich and textual as the sources and the studies that you bring to us is your obvious passion for equality and the rights of everyone. So I just so appreciate that coming through in both of your voices and your studies. And I also want to just suggest that, Keren, it didn't escape me the news clips that you posted, including reference to yourself. And I think it's important to acknowledge your bravery and the importance of everyone who, and I consider myself a feminist, everyone who stands up to say that our patriarchal system is not serving either men or women or wherever you are in the gender spectrum well, with abuses that are rampant. And as I think you indicated, it's not just amongst Jews, of course, of certain industries, but it's rampant in our society. So with that intro, I just want to make a recommendation, I think, as much as a question. And it has to do with the idea of men's club in an egalitarian, conservative Jewish movement. I am deeply troubled by it. I have been a proud member in the past and now an ex-member of anything affiliated with that type of discrimination. I say that publicly, perhaps for the first time, because I've said it privately to others, but it's become very clear to me that any system and synagogue membership that perpetrates the idea that we will exclude people based on their gender identity or their sex. And the last straw for me was when years ago we were doing Scotch in the Sukkah, and Elsie Letterman, for those of you who remember her of blessed memory, would join us for a l'chaim every Shabbat Kiddush with Scotch. And when I said, well, our Scotch in the Sukkah has to be open to women, I was told, no, it couldn't be. And I said, you're going to exclude Elsie Letterman from Scotch in the Sukkah? And I was told, yes. And I said, okay, see ya. That's not an organization I want to belong to. I don't have a problem with sisterhood. And as many of you know, I've converted my energies to our LGBTQ work at our synagogue. I think it's important that historically underrepresented and oppressed groups have a voice and an independent space. But what I want to recommend is that all of our synagogue-based memberships, affiliations, and events at least have a disclaimer that every event is open to everyone. It's okay for people to self-select and to not join a group. And it's okay, I think, especially important for women in LGBTQ, which, by the way, is actually the most encompassing of all the groups. The LGBT group is with every person along the gender spectrum and sexual orientation. And there is no, all of one. And that's why I'm proudest to be part of that group. But I think the fact is, if a group of women choose to study together or to get together to talk about these issues, that's important. But when a group of men does it with synagogue blessings as an indicated membership affiliation and excludes women, given the power dynamic in our country, I just don't understand why the conservative movement allows that. So I'm going to ask that as a question to both of you, asking us to reconcile that. And then I'm going to post to chat something that I wrote as we were speaking today, which I would suggest is a bylaw for our synagogue board of trustees to consider. Hopefully you could save the chat. I'd send it along in the future. But I think we should have something that specifically states in our bylaws that we are an egalitarian organization and synagogue, and all events and memberships are open to everyone. If people choose not to go, if a group of men want to get together at the bar, that's fine, but don't do it under the synagogue letterhead. That's my opinion.
Before the speakers speak, I'd just like to address that as a past president of Sisterhood and a current member of Sisterhood. We have always written that everyone is invited to all of our programs. I was not aware that the men's club even did that, but I did feel that poker night, the kinds of programs that men's club have are much different than the kind of clubs, the kind of events that Sisterhood has, which, poker night, football, I'm just probably advancing stereotypes. But I do know when they had the tefillin, they have a day every time to put on tefillin. I felt the first time that was held, I actually complained about it, that I felt that women were excluded, and I was told, no, that's not the case. You have to read the whole thing. And now I think they've made more of an effort to include women. But if you don't say everyone is invited and everyone is welcome and it doesn't matter what your gender is, I think that's so backwards. Like, I spoke to this at a Sisterhood Shabbat it had to be more than 10 years ago, because when I was the president of Sisterhood Shabbat, and at that time we didn't have a men's club. But I did read an article that was widely distributed by the head of all the men's clubs for conservative Judaism, complaining that there were too many women in Jewish life and too many women on the pulpit, and that Jewish life was becoming feminized. And this was a goal of the men's clubs, was to prevent Jewish communal life from becoming feminized. So I don't know what to tell you. He's not around anymore, but I guess there's still vestiges of that. And now I'll let the speaker speak, but I did want to defend at least sisterhood, and possibly the men's club has evolved. And it was just maybe who was particularly the president at that time, because that is very, very, I wish I had known it at the time. I would have come in with you with placards and whatever you needed, because that's wrong.
If I can maybe, I was gonna say, if I could just hop in quickly.
Yeah, go ahead, everyone.
No. I thought this is really,
because I'll never stop talking.
This is very, for me, it's very, no, I mean, look, I mean, there's a lot to say. I think one thing I'll say in defense of sisterhood as well, is that I think, and this comes up a lot in conversations that I'm in also participating in about around racial justice. I think we need to be able to hold two ideas at the same time. We need to talk about equality, but we also need to talk about equity. And equity is a way of, I think, better capturing what's at stake for a sisterhood meeting, which is to say groups that have been marginalized previously need those spaces. And I think that's really what you're kind of alluding to, I think, is that the need for spaces to be able to work through that experience, this transformation that's occurring, what's happening as the collective experience, but also like hoping to push the larger community in certain directions. It sometimes needs those protected spaces. And those that have been in power sometimes need to just step back. And I think that that's really part of, what I think is at stake in this conversation, is like the self-reflexivity that I think I was trying to describe is, I think, includes this idea of like, when being an ally sometimes requires you to stop talking and to just let others do the talking. And sometimes it might need you to advocate in different ways that might not be open. So I think, this is a real conversation. It's an important one, but.
I have so many thoughts, and I agree with Paul, and I also, in terms of spaces, and at the same time, I want to go back to Louis for a moment and just thank you for what you said. I had no idea when I wrote what I wrote in June of 2018 what the ripple effects would be and how big that would become. And in so many ways, it's good I didn't know. But in any case, I'm so ready to pass the baton and to encourage others and some people have reached out to me, and I just want to take this opportunity to say, if anyone is trying to navigate their way forward, to say that it's much better on the other side once you do. But that there are other people who need to get involved and are trying to get involved, and I encourage that. But also to thank Louis for identifying as a feminist, because I think part of what we need to do is to explain what feminism is, and to dismantle, debunk stereotypes about feminists and being bra burners, feminism being, about hating men. And whenever I talk about feminism in public, I talk about loving men, as I do, those in my family and friends. But the point being that feminism is about equality and equity. It is not about taking away from or disempowering anyone. And listening to Louis just then and to Paul, I was thinking about and Susan, what you said about what someone had claimed about spaces being feminized, and I take issue with the scholar who has promoted that, in fact, because that is coming from, even if that scholar self-identifies as a feminist, and I'm doing that very intentionally, because that, in fact, is along the same lines as the idea of that person who once said that a woman rabbi belongs on the bima like an orange on the Seder plate, which is in fact not what the orange on the Seder plate was all about. As Susanna Heschel, who is the person who originally suggested that, it was not about female rabbis, it was about LGBTQ plus and everyone else on the margins inclusion. So what we're really talking about is full equality, full equity, full inclusion, in order to allow all people to reach their full human potential. And that's like the ultimate goal. And how we do that involves sharing power. And yes, to the question about, is it really about sexual conquest, or is it about power? Well, it's more about power. Sex is sort of the means to that. But the power piece of it is difficult because people don't readily give up power. That's why there are wars, and that's why I don't use the phrase sexual revolution lightly. There needs to be revolution. There needs to be a certain degree of radicalism. And yeah, I'll just stop there. More questions?
Jeremy, you had a question.
Keren addressed it, but I don't think everyone may have been following on the chat, so I'll just repeat it. And my question was, do you think that the source of the sexual predators is sexual desire or the desire for power and domination? Keren, I think you addressed it, but maybe Paul too, because one of the sources of Reb Nachman was talking sort of about the desire and the yearning for, which is part of, I guess, a Hasidic thought. And anyway, so that's I'm throwing that out. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I'd be happy to speak a little bit to that point, because I think that, I'm usually in an academic context, I'm very reluctant to put on any kind of, theological or even sometimes like, normative philosophical hat, because I think I have a beard and I cover my head, so people just immediately, they typecast me as if I'm something that can be pinned down, and whatever, that's a different conversation. But I think that, I think that your question is an important one, because I think what I was sort of trying to gesture at is that, I do think that this is also a theological question. Like as an ethical one, it's a theological one for me, at least, which is to say that I think the question of power is so crucial, because I think what we see is that, the institutionalization of some of these, these dynasties and, for example, Hasidic dynasties that emerged in the 19th century, or the yeshiva movement that's been institutionalized today, we see where human power and the lust for human power becomes the priority. And I am not interested in human power. And I think, meaning like politically, ethically, normatively, I believe that there is a single creator, and I want to serve that creator. And that creator has, if there's power, that creator, and again, however that might be defined, is reserved for the creator alone. And so I think what I see in Reb Nachman, at least, is a gesture at this. And it's actually, it's going back to a teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, which the Baal Shem Tov spoke a lot about this question. I believe it's in, it's a reading of Shir HaShirim, if I'm not mistaken. Behold, my beloved stands behind a wall, peering through a window, like peeking through the lattice, or something to that effect. And the Baal Shem Tov is basically saying, like, you have an accountability at all times. You can't hide from your creator. And to act as if you could is the moment at which you exert, the accountability is broken, and you're exerting a sense of power over others, because you're acting as if you're the master of your existence, but you're not. And I think part of what I see the real, the sort of spiritual crisis that I think we're gesturing at here is part of that, of the sense of, like, in the pursuit to become this ideal man, the powerful man, to be in the room where it happens, if you want to, quote Lin-Manuel Miranda and Hamilton, and to create these exclusive spaces, all that, I think it's really fundamentally, it's forgetting. It's a symptom of that forgetting, of the fact that like we don't ultimately have power. If anything that COVID should teach us also in this moment, like to really think about what we're doing in terms of like renegotiating our social milieu, our sense of our trust in, public health, or our trust in others, all of this, all the things that we could talk about in the midst of this pandemic. I think the one thing that I feel like it's continuous with what we've been talking about in this kind of reflection on the Me Too movement is like, we don't have power over our existence. And so we should probably use the short amount of time that we're here on this planet to make it possible for everyone to live their best life, to feel like they're living a life of true liberation and freedom. And I think that for me it speaks to this question of like, if I'm going to learn from these sources, it's going to be that element of like always thinking about those opportunities that I might be wielding power over others, not knowing I am, like my relationship with my students. I think about this all the time in the seminar room. Like if I hold one person's opinion up as correct and someone's as incorrect or off scale, what does that do to that person's sense of their own ability to converse? How am I valuing every member of a conversation? How am I learning when I should stop? I should stop talking. That's just me reminding myself, I should probably just, curb my need to fill the space. So yeah, I think it's a great question, Jeremy, and I'm going to heed my own norm.
Oh, Paul, I feel like my life has been enriched by meeting you, and I am grateful for your allyhood. And I want to segue just by sharing a quote by the Baal Shem Tov, which is the following, which is, "From every human being there rises a light that reaches straight to heaven. And when two souls that are destined to be together find each other, their streams of light flow together, and a single brighter light gives forth from their united being." It was something that I included in my book, Still Jewish. And I include that, and I'm mentioning it now because thinking about what Paul said in terms of voices and who's speaking and who's not, as it relates to power, and as it relates to the earlier question, Jeremy's question, it's so important because when there is one voice, it is at the exclusion of the other voices. And that's part of what I tried to illustrate in my portion that I shared with you, because vis-a-vis the narrative about Jewish continuity, because there are so many other voices and there are so many other questions that we can ask. And when we don't ask those, and when we don't include the other voices, and when we don't champion other books like Jew Asian, and I have so many books, Kugel and Frijoles, which is about Latino Jews in America, we miss out on the rich diversity that is the American Jewish community. So it is to our benefit to listen as much as, or if not more than, we speak.
I'm going to call briefly on Sheila Kaufman because she's the current president of the Sisterhood, just to give us a little more information about the policy of the Women's League and the Sisterhood. Sheila?
Thanks, Susan. Women's League is we are part of USCJ, and just like Men's Club, we each have our own groups, and we're there for support, camaraderie, and enriching our lives as women. And we don't support, our programs are very open for everyone, and that's why on every single program that Miriam Sisterhood puts out, we say all are welcome, including our meetings. We provide a place that people can talk uninhibited. And if people question things, we're there for support, we're there for help, assistance. It's non-biased, and it's actually quite good that women have a place to go, that men have a place to go in Men's Club. and that the LGBTQ community have a place to go to talk about their issues and where they need to go. So in that respect, I think it's, as far as the support, I think it's really there. And we're open for others. So that's what I can have to say as far as sisterhood is concerned.
Sheila, if I could just respond for a second and applaud you. I'm not suggesting in any way that women shouldn't have a space, in the LGBTQ community shouldn't have a space, and that space is sacred. And I do understand what you're saying, and at my professional life, I promote exactly what you're talking about. What I am saying is that the power dynamic is different traditionally for the patriarchy and for men to exclude women. Ruth Bader Ginsburg said women need to be wherever decisions are being made. The men's club has not had the same enlightened view that you've shared. That is a problem for us as an egalitarian synagogue. I just think it needs to be stated in our bylaws that if anybody wants, as you are already doing at Sisterhood, but it needs to be clear that anyone who wants to attend anything should be able to, because we had a transgender member who took her own life. And I dare say that, you know, if we're sending a message that we are excluding based on our sexual identification or whatever biological basis there is, you may be excluding people unintentionally. And that is not the message we want to send to our community. So I applaud the work that you're doing and that Sisterhood is doing. I think it needs to come on the other side of the fence. And that's why I'm proposing the language that I put in the chat.
Thank you, Louis. I'm going to go on because we do have some more people asking questions, and you have brought this subject up, and it's important to all the congregants that are listening. Alice Cohen had a question. Alice?
Continuing on this subject, one thing that I would like to ask the speakers is, how do they deal with, in this inclusion environment, also helping individuals who previously had not been empowered, such as women, such as our Black Lives Matter community? I went to a women's college, and I feel very strongly about women's colleges and what it did for me. And we have historically Black colleges, and they are open now, but we also don't want to dilute their voices, and help also to teach people to be empowered and make their voices heard. So I wonder if they could comment about how helps. We've talked about equity and equality. How do you help raise the voices of those who had previously been suppressed?
Well, I do it in my own daily life and work by supporting people who are reaching out and trying to navigate their own Me Too journeys, whether it's something they want to do publicly, how exactly they want to, you know, what do they want? What are they hoping to achieve? And oftentimes it's justice, and then it's a question of, well, what does justice look like to you? And also being as generous as possible with really sharing the limelight, and with giving credit where credit is due, and with inviting people to participate rather than being the sole participant in something. And by refusing to participate in something if it's only, you know, one sex. So there are multiple ways of doing it, and also mentoring junior scholars as well. That's extremely important. You know, just as a very concrete example, being the chair for an Association for Jewish Studies panel that was all graduate students, and helping them, you know, feel confident about their scholarship and that they're contributing new knowledge to the field of Jewish studies. So I try and do it as I bridge academia, activism, and community in every way I can think of.
I guess I would add that, you know, for me, in my reflecting on my own scholarship, I guess one thing I've really been trying to set as a sort of just a sort of a principle I try to abide by is just always to examine, who do I include in my footnotes? Like who am I citing? Who am I in conversation with? Do I start to notice like, oh, it does seem like in this field it's all men, or in this field there are no people of color, and so how do I, especially when thinking about like if I work on modern European Jews, I think about, well, how can I broaden the conversation? And so I try to think about theory I can bring into the conversation. I try to think about, feminist theorists or queer theorists that are working with new models of, historical time, or what does that add to the conversation? How does that help me reflect on, these questions I'm asking about a period that, some historians think they've exhausted everything there is to say about Jews in Germany, and I think that kind of, it's not really a full answer to your question, Alice, which is a really important one. But I think of it as like maybe methodologically, always asking myself, how am I broadening the conversation? How am I listening to voices that are speaking? How am I heeding them? And in some ways, maybe on the macro level, I think what you're alluding to is, this question again of equity, of like trying to find ways to support the spaces or the conversations that are taking place with underrepresented groups, and to note that. And I think this is the part where this is something I've learned a lot from working on affect theory, theories of emotion, theories of feeling. This is often a very uncomfortable conversation for people, especially for men who, for a long time, look, I mean, I know many good men, they're good people. They're trying to be better people, but sometimes you can be a good guy and have unexamined premises, unexamined elements of who you are. And then you can perpetuate through silence or through not knowing or through a willful ignorance even of how these structures function. You can perpetuate the same problems. And I think the question for me is like, how can I face the discomfort, and how can I sit with it? And sometimes maybe that's really what it comes down to, is knowing in those spaces, when we're in those spaces and we're trying to create inclusive spaces, I think I just tell myself, like, everyone in this room is negotiating a discomfort of some sort, because it's, maybe they're worried their voice isn't going to be heard. Maybe I should just negotiate that discomfort of knowing my voice probably, like when I speak, people, I mean, I might feel anxious about my own expertise in my field, but people seem to listen when I speak because of who I am, because of how I present. And that's something that's a privilege that I try to, like, I don't take for granted, I think. And maybe that's, I don't know, maybe that's a gesture in that direction.
I had questions, but I'm going to just email them to you, because I just think there's so much to think about. And I want to just tell you how gratified I am to our speakers and our questioners, our congregants, because this has gone to such a higher level that I feel spiritually affected by the program as more than I expected to be, because I thought it would be about learning and psychology and other things, but I didn't expect to. My goal was met, our goal was met, because it's like, how are we going to make this better? That was the subtext or the goal that I had, but I just couldn't have even imagined the spirituality and the Jewishness that this program would elicit. And I just want to thank our speakers, and I would ask them both just now to tell us about what you're working on now, because you both have books that you're working on or projects that have such fascinating and inclusive topics to them. So if, as a way of ending up, could you each speak a little bit to what you're doing now and what you're trying to accomplish with the scholarly work that you're doing now? Keren?
Sure. Thank you again. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, everyone, for sharing this virtual space, including my cat Tikva behind us. And I think what I'm working on now is this interfaith, the other interfaith, meaning not Jewish interpartnerships with people of other faith backgrounds, but how women of different faiths, Jewish, Muslim, and Christian, have experienced Me Too and have spoken out in a variety of ways, and how that is in fact transforming our respective religions. So that's my scholarly work. There's also my activism, and I'm going to put in the chat my website, which was on in my presentation, the Love and Tradition Institute, so people can feel welcome to contact me through that. And then my upcoming work with USCJ, and I'll be handling, like, there are multiple parts that I'll be continuing with, as well as teaching a course about the American Jewish woman at Brandeis this spring. And really, I want to mention the word privilege, because I don't know that we've just said it out loud. And it's so important to do that. And both as a scholar and as an activist, to encourage people. And this is something that I've learned through my scholarship, particularly interviewing people of other faiths about the ways in which they've been disempowered, is to think about our own sense of privilege. And if we're not, if we're not a white Jewish male, but we're a white Jewish female, we still have white privilege. And if we're a Jew of color, but we are, comfortable economically, we still have socioeconomic privilege. There's so many layers to privilege, and understanding that is so important. And I also just want to share one last thing that I've been learning, which is about trusting your intuition, which really took me, on a personal note, years to do. And I want to encourage everyone, and this may be the little bit of psychology you're hoping for, Susan, and I'm not a psychologist, but I will share, because I did read in one of the descriptions something about we'll be learning skills and tools. And okay, so here it is for you. Trust your kishkas, trust your guts. If something does not feel kosher, or if something, if you feel excluded, say something, do something. If it feels wrong, most likely it's wrong. If if it feels like you're not being fully welcomed or fully included, most likely there's something slightly off, and you can be part of the change. So I hope that you will, and we'll do it together.
Yes, that's right. Again.
I guess I'll just briefly say, so the book project I'm working on right now, which really looks at the way that Jewish identity in the modern period has been shaped by, and in response to, but also through making sense of what this designation of Jewish, racial Jewishness, what it meant. And so what that means is really, I'm trying to think about the ways in which Jews in Europe in the 19th century and the early 20th century experienced racializing structures that shaped how Jews imagined their prospects for, community or agency, how they saw themselves in the eyes of Europeans, how they saw themselves as never being able to fit in Europe. The story of Zionism starts in this same moment as well. But the goal of it is not just to tell a historical story. I'm really trying to understand how, as I think Keren really clearly explained, like the ways and the layers, the intersecting layers of privileges that I think Jews have also come to experience in our contemporary world. I'm sort of trying to understand how we have been affected by those ideas of race, how we've internalized them without maybe knowing it, how we might think of ourselves in both positive and negative. I'm trying not to say that race is always a negative. I'm looking at a lot of critical race theory and Black studies, and trying to understand how, in thinking about Black folks in America trying to negotiate these identities that similarly with, the Middle Passage, all these ethnic tribal identities, spiritual practice completely stripped away, and Black folks were reduced simply to the color of their skin, and then nevertheless found new cultural projects for identity formation to create something meaningful about who they were. So I'm trying to think about how Jews did a parallel, they had a parallel move in Europe, but how, because of the difference, the privilege of being able to, especially in the contemporary world where the color line is so stark, Jews, for the most part, if you're Ashkenazi and if you're also able to sort of, more or less pass culturally, Jews are racialized again now as white, but have this memory that seems to conflict with it. And so a lot of the questions I have with my students, and I noticed a couple interesting comments in the chat, maybe this speaks to it. A lot of my students that are millennials will often say, well, but I'm not white, I'm Jewish. And we have this conversation in some of my classes where I'm like, well, what does whiteness mean to you? Like, why is it so uncomfortable to own the privileges that come with the skin that you embody? And in this book, I'm trying to think about both the discomfort with being labeled as white, like why are Jews feeling that sense of discomfort, but also to understand perhaps like where we as a community in America, but I think as a diaspora community especially, need to think about the ways in which if we feel like we've learned something from our historical experience of negotiating race, how can we be better allies to people of color that are fighting these battles against systemic racism, and what can we do with the power we now have? Again, maybe it's a parallel to the conversation we're having. I see them as intersecting kind of goals. Like, how can men, again, be better allies? I'm also thinking, how can Jews more collectively think about being better allies? What conversations do we have access to that we might be able to help open a door for, or maybe exempt ourselves from? Maybe we don't have to be, so those are some of the questions I'm kind of thinking about.
Well, thank you both. Jeremy, do you have any final thoughts before we? Well, I'll thank everyone for coming, and we're gonna, I can't say goodbye because I think we're gonna, as I have always predicted, we will meet somehow, somewhere. And this was just a wonderful, wonderful journey for us. And thank you both for participating. And we're going to follow you in the future, and we hope that you will join us again, or our paths will cross somehow.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Susan.
you, everyone else. Does anyone else want to say anything before we end the meeting? Okay, we're good. I'll let Justin do whatever he does. Justin?
Not a problem. Thank you guys very much. And it was on YouTube, so if you'd like to rewatch it, feel free, and it'll be reposted again as well. So enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and hope to see you guys soon.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Be well.
Are we going to just leave?